Do you ever beat around the bush when approaching a difficult conversation? We've all heard the phrase and understand its meaning, but where did the phrase come from and how old is it? To learn the etymology of this often heard phrase, stay tuned to this episode of History of Everyday Sayings. This is your host, Stephen Carter, and I welcome you to this episode of History of Everyday Sayings. This show is for you if you're a logophile, a writer, a speaker, a philomath, or you simply love history tidbits you can use to impress friends and family. Each episode is short, they're bite-sized for easy listening and recall. By listening, you're going to discover how phrases and words we use every day came to be. I was listening to a song by Marvin Gaye called Let's Get It On when I heard the lyrics, "Stop beating round the bush." As so often happens, interesting phrases show up at exactly the right time. In this case, when I had been thinking about potential phrases for this episode of the podcast. The phrase beat around the bush, as it's used today, means to avoid coming to the point and perhaps even prevaricating or otherwise not providing all relevant information. I think we all understand the general meaning of this term, but where did the phrase come from? Let's begin our investigation with the QPB Encyclopedia of Word and Phrase Origins by Robert Hendrickson. This resource tells us hunters once hired beaters who started birds, in other words, got them moving, who started birds and other game for them by beating the bush to flush them into the open, so the hunter could get a clear shot at the game. The beaters had to approach their jobs carefully so as to not scare the game too early. As a side note, I suspect they did not want to flush out game that could be harmful to them or the hunters, such as a wild boar, for example, and indeed the beaters did have to approach their jobs carefully. Hendrickson tells us etymologist Ernest Weekley and some others believe the expression dates back to the early 16th century. Weekley points to the old proverb that goes, quote, "I will not beat the bush, that another may have the bird," close quote, and to another saying, quote, "to around the bush," close quote, which was a reference for hounds hesitating when circling the bush. Weekley believes those two sayings combined to form the term beat around the bush. The resource Know Your Phrase tells us there was an early use of the phrase beat about the bush, and it came from a poem written by George Gascoigne in 1572 that included the lines, "To think Beau he abused was, alas my heart it bleeds. He bet about the bush, while others caught the birds." Close quote. It is interesting to look at how words were spelled back in this period. Think, Thinke, and bleeds, Bleeds, bush, Bushe. In the resource phrases.org, we're told, the figurative meaning of the odd phrase beat around the bush, or as it is usually expressed in the UK, beat about the bush, evolved from the earlier literal meaning. In bird hunts, some of the participants roused the birds by beating the bushes and enabling others to use a much later phrase to cut to the chase and catch the quarry in nets. So beating about the bush was the preamble to the main event, which was the capturing of the birds. Of course, grouse hunting and other forms of hunt still use beaters even today. The phrase is old and first appeared in the medieval poem Generydes, and that's Generydes, Generydes, a romance in 7-line stanzas, circa 1440, and the relevant lines, but as it hath be said, full long ago, some beat the bush, and some the birds take, close quote. Not exactly riveting poetry, but hey, I guess it gets the message across. Again, with odd spelling, but, B-U-T-T, Sade, S-A-Y-D-E, ago, A-G-O-O, and some bet, or beat, B-E-T-E, the bush, B-U-S-S-H, and the birds take, B-Y-R-D-E-S. I think it's a good thing that, for the most part, the spelling of words is pretty much uniform or universal, except, of course, some words still are spelled differently for the same word in England or the United Kingdom versus, say, the United States. Few people know the origin of this often used phrase, beat around the bush, but you can now count yourself among the elite of people who do. If you're curious about exploring more about this term, beat around the bush, you'll find the references I use for this podcast episode in the show notes. For more amazing history of everyday sayings, tasty auditory tidbits you can use to amaze friends and family, please do subscribe for free where you get your podcasts. If you would like to comment on this or any other episode, you can email me at cartermethod@gmail.com, cartermethod@gmail.com. Thank you for joining me on this episode. Until our next visit, I'm your host, Stephen Carter, and I wish you blessings in abundance.